Hello and welcome. I'm Jessica. I'm with Literary Arts. Thank you all for being here for it's not morning and it's morning, right? A morning with the 2022 Oregon Book Award finalists for the Leslie Bradshaw Award for Young Adult Literature. Thank you all for being here. I'm so excited. Before we get started, I want to open up the space with the land acknowledgement. Literary Arts is based in Portland, Oregon, and we are currently on unceded land. The Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Wotlallabans, the Tualatin Kalpuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River occupied and operated this land long before Western colonizers arrived, and many continue to do so today. Despite attempts of removal and erasure, these communities remain a strong and vital part of our future. Literary Arts recognizes that this acknowledgement is only a small step in affirming the ongoing presence and contributions of our Native communities, and we commit to engaging these communities more fully as we fulfill our mission. For those of you who are not familiar with Literary Arts, we are a nonprofit community-based arts organization with more than 35 years serving readers and writers. Our mission is to engage readers, support writers, and to inspire the next generation with great literature. Our programs include Portland Arts and Lectures, programs for youth, the Oregon Book Awards and Fellowships Program, and the Portland Book Festival. We also offer reader seminars, writing classes, and free literary events like this one year-round. Again, I want to thank all our finalists for being here, and I will introduce our first reader today, JC Geiger. JC survived an earthquake on the mouth of Hell Volcano in Nicaragua, learned to drive stick shift on a bookmobile, and once fell asleep while running. He is a Grand Slam storytelling champion at the Moth, and his work has appeared on stage at the Second City and No Shame Theater. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I think the first thing to say is being a finalist in this category is a really big deal for me personally. So I'm just really honored and want to thank Literary Arts and all the other finalists for being here. It's really exciting. So thank you. Before I read, I just wanted to share that I actually grew up fairly far away from Oregon. I grew up in a tiny town in the Midwest. It's like one of these kind of water towers that you see flashing past you while you're driving like 80 miles an hour. And you think, thank God I don't live there. This is where I grew up. So surrounded by cornfields all the way to the horizon. And there was nothing much to do. And I never really felt like I belonged. But there was one saving grace, which was we lived on the edge of great radio. And what I mean by that is Chicago is about 80 miles away, which when you're, 14, 15 might as well be the moon, except for the fact that there was this radio station, WXRT 93.1 FM, that was incredible, but you could only get the frequency sometimes, like when the weather was right, with the right stereo on the right little hilltop in town. And so I spent a lot of my early teen years and then into my teenage years kind of loosely tethered to this greater, much more exciting world through this really inconsistent radio signal that was this hint, this peak of like more excitement, another world, different ways of living, different ways of experiencing things. And I never kind of let go of that idea. And eventually I ended up moving to Chicago. And then of course, later I ended up moving to Oregon, but I kept this kind of thought about everyone's life as a teenager, when, especially if you grow up in a place where you don't feel like you fit or belong, which is many teenagers, the importance of these windows, these kind of inconsistent windows where you can catch a glimmer of life beyond being a teenager. And so I got really obsessed with radio as well. And my son and I would go out to the coast around Yachats and Florence, and we would bring these little things, which are so great. I mean, I'm so glad they still make them. And, we turn them on and you hear things like this, We just surf the radio and try to find something good. And, Tobias would be like, Dad, I got a classic rock song, or, hey, this is really weird, listen to this. And so we got really into this, and some experiences I had on the coast, and learning about kind of some of the disaster preparedness culture there, and then some tragedies that have happened on the coast with people being taken by the waves. All of those kind of gelled into this book, which is The Great Big One. And I'm going to read a short section from that. I've taken some of my time to tell the story rather than read, but I think it's important context. So the section I'm going to read is, so for some context, we have two twin brothers, Leo and Griff, and they have invited their friends Thomas and Charity along to do what they call song fishing, which is bringing these kind of little radios out and attempting to catch the best song in the world. So I think that's all the context you need. Leo is speaking here. Do you ever notice how crazy radio stations get at night? Charity nodded. She pulled out the small red radio. Leo handed Griff and Thomas inferior sets with earbuds, not even headphones. Charity leaned forward, intent. It's because AM radio signals behave differently when the sun goes down. The sun electrifies certain layers in the atmosphere that keep signals close to their source. But then at night, astronomical twilight, Thomas said. Yes, radio signals can roam all over the world. Everywhere it's dark. You can hear songs in Russia, Texas, Ecuador, Patagonia. It's a minor miracle. Wow, Charity said. How do I not know this? I was explaining, Griff said, in study hall. The word study hall landed like a block of wood. Leo plowed ahead. It's called surfing the skip, Leo said. People do it everywhere, and this is one of the best places in the world because of the sea and the shape of the cliffs. Leo knew for the same reason Griff knew. Their father walking them down this stretch of beach, taking them on low-tide hikes to the lighthouse, explaining the curvature of the treacherous cove at God's mouth, the ionizing effect of salt in the air. But before Griff could offer information about waves and salt, Thomas went tearing off toward the ocean, and Charity ran after him. Out past dune grass and sand, low-tide mudflats stretched like the malodorous skin of a reptile's back, wet craters teeming with life, mollusks seamless as stones, open-throated anemones, proboscises, and pinchers. Thomas crouched near a sand-bound boulder. He popped the stone with a low sucking sound. Beneath it, a confetti of white-shelled crabs, the simmering reflection like a china plate moon boiled over, racing off sideways. The gift of freedom, Thomas said. Run, my crustacean brothers. Do not squander what I have given you. Charity was laughing. They were all laughing, and Leo said, please listen. Everyone had bandwidth assignments. Leo would take 550 to 900, Charity 900 to 1100, Thomas 1100 to 1400, and Griff had the top of the dial all the way up to 1600 AM. What's the goal? Charity asked. What are we looking for? Leo smiled. The best song in the world. Charity took off her shoes, rolled up her pant legs, and cuffed them. It was a rare night, growing warmer as the evening lengthened. Winds laid down calm, salty breeze just balmy enough to seduce you into the bone-shaking cold of the water. They held still. Griff followed her eyes to the tide line, a blazing white rim at the edge of the world. She removed her jacket. Barefoot, she ran across the flats. Her feet made small rippling splashes like skipped stones. He would just follow her. It was okay to follow her. He walked until the water built just below his knees. He turned the radio on. In his ears, a white noise tumble of voices, notes. Pum, 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 and a sudden urgent call. Griff, Leo was screaming at him. Move! Over there! The moon had shed its orange blush and emerged bone white, laying a bright, wobbly carpet across the water. Charity walked the light like a runway, and Griff followed. In his earbuds, the noise changed. He fumbled through the noise and into voices. AM talk shows. Now, the problem we're dealing with here, we know the problem. What have you caught, Griff? Charity called back to him. Scourge of the airwaves, Griff said. White-bellied talk toads. She laughed. Throw him back. Thomas, what do you got? Rack rock, he screamed from a distance. What? Rack rock, Thomas said. New country AM. Racks on women, racks on deers, racks of beer. Glad I ain't queer. Rack rock. Throw them all back, Charity shouted. Amazing to see her in such joy, leaping the shock of incoming waves, eyes angled on her dial, determined, and a sudden thrilling thought. What if Griff caught the song that changed their lives? Thank you all so much for the time to tell the story and to read that section to you all. It was an honor to do so.
Thank you, JC. That was wonderful to hear.
Thank you.
Our next reader is Courtney Gold. Hi, Courtney.
Hello.
Courtney writes books about queer girls, ghosts, and things that go bump in the night. She graduated from Pacific Lutheran University in 2016 with a bachelor's degree in creative writing and publishing. She continues to write love letters to haunted girls and rural empty spaces. The Dead in the Dark is her debut novel. Thanks for being here, Courtney.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that introduction. And thank you, JC. That reading was awesome. I feel like I have that visual in my head forever now. So my debut novel, The Dead in the Dark, came out in August of 2021. It is about two girls, one the daughter of TV ghost hunters, and the other a small town golden girl in Eastern Oregon. And the story follows the two of them as they have to investigate a series of disappearances that take place in the town of Snakebite, Oregon, and get to the bottom of the potentially supernatural forces that are behind the disappearances. Along the way, they confront small town prejudice and fall in love. And so I'll be reading a section from chapter 2 of the book. Thank you so much. I appreciate you putting this together, Ashley. It's beautiful. Mrs. Granger gripped her husband's wrist and dabbed at her smudged eyeliner with a wadded Kleenex. Tristan would have loved it. The sun was high over Snakebite Memorial, cutting jagged shadows across the yellow grass. The weird thing about the cemetery, Ashley thought, was that it actually had the best view in town. The hills around Snakebite were rugged and misshapen, shadowed by passing clouds and golden with clusters of dry dirt and rabbit brush. At the base of the hill, blue-green Lake Oahe met the gravelly shore and twisted on for as far as she could see. It didn't seem fair that the only people with a view like this were the ones who couldn't take it in. But maybe you had to die to see the valley this way. Tristan Granger wouldn't see it. He had no body to bury. I hope it helps, Ashley said. She pulled her black cardigan tight around her chest to block out the wind. I just thought if Tristan knew we were still looking for him, maybe he'd come home. Mrs. Granger nodded. I hope you're right. A stand at the front of the vigil held a photo of Tristan for everyone to see. It was Ashley's favorite photo of him. Unkempt, sandy blonde hair, a ratty black hoodie, and the same basketball shorts he'd worn every day since freshman year. His chin rested on his hands, smile easy and warm. The picture would be cheesy if it was anyone else, but nothing looked cheesy on Tristan, ever. Today marked 6 months since Tristan's disappearance. 5 months since the application deadline for University of Oregon closed. 3 months since Oahe County Police stopped looking for a person and started looking for a body. A month and a half since Tristan missed his high school graduation. 1 month since Sheriff Paris called the disappearance of Tristan Granger a cold case. Today was their 4-year anniversary, but Ashley tried not to think about that. You two were so good. I know he loved you, Mrs. Granger said. You've got your mom's spirit, though. I wish I was that strong. Ashley said nothing and looked across the vigil. Tammy Barton stood at the refreshment table with a plastic cup of lemon water in one hand, gently managing several conversations at once. It wasn't the first time today somebody had compared Ashley to her mother, but each time she was reminded of how untrue the comparison was. Tammy's expression was a careful balance of warmth and grief, her stance inviting and solemn all at once. Ashley wished she had even half of her mother's poise. As if on cue, Tammy turned and caught her gaze. She made her way from the refreshments and delicately placed a hand on Ashley's shoulder, softening her practiced smile into a small, sympathetic frown for Tristan's parents. Greg, Susan, I'm so sorry about all this. You know we're praying for you and your family every day. Tammy, Mrs. Granger said, thank you for everything. By everything, Susan Granger meant money. Whatever Tammy Barton couldn't provide in emotional support, she made up for tenfold in financial support. Over the last decade, Barton Ranch had almost completely taken over Oahe County. The vigil, the food, the decorations, it was all on Ashley's mother's tab. Tammy reached out and took Mrs. Granger's hand. We were practically family. I wish there was something I could do. There's nothing you can do, Mr. Granger said. His gaze shifted to Sheriff Paris, who stood alone at the front of the vigil, quietly eyeing Tristan's photo. There's something he could do, though. Frank is doing everything he can with the evidence he has, Greg. Tammy put a hand on his shoulder. People can point fingers all they want, but he has to prove it. Ashley grimaced. Since Tristan's disappearance, she'd had this exact conversation 1,000 times. The vigil was supposed to be a time just to think about Tristan, but even here, people only wanted to talk about Brandon Woodley. Until a few months ago, Ashley had never heard of the Snakebite resident turned TV ghost hunter. But the moment he arrived in town, it was like everyone forgot how to breathe, like everyone forgot how to talk about anyone else. Some of the suspicion made sense. Brandon Woodley was apparently here to film an episode of his show, but he hadn't brought any cameras or crew. As far as Ashley could tell, he'd just been wandering around Snakebite for the last 6 months with no intention of leaving. That might not make waves somewhere else, but Snakebite wasn't the kind of town where people lingered. In Snakebite, you were either fleeting or permanent. People who came to town always left, and people who left didn't come back. Except Brandon Woodley. According to her mother, Brandon had been gone for almost 13 years, and no one had paid him a single thought since the day he left. He was an unknown entity, a ghost from a version of Snakebite that existed before Ashley. Just the thought of him made her uneasy. And then, a week after his return, Tristan vanished. I'm going to get some water, Ashley said. Careful, the lemons aren't great. I think they might be old, Tammy said. She gave Ashley's shoulder a single pat. Across the service, Fran Campos and Bug Gunderson chatted quietly. Ashley drifted toward them, and it felt as if she were finally coming to shore. Everyone else here was bent on asking her 1,000 questions about Tristan. When was the last time you saw him? Did he say where he was going? Did he ever mention Brandon Woodley? But Fran and Bug were better than that. They were her best friends and the only comfort she'd had in the last 6 months, like twin beacons in a night that refused to end. Fran spotted Ashley and pulled her into a tight hug, honey-colored curls bobbing at her slender shoulders. Bug hovered behind them with a glass of lemonade clutched between her fingers. Her freckle-smattered face was distant, her little mouth a frown, eyes trained on the lake. Say the word and we can go, Fran said. She tucked a wisp of Ashley's hair behind her ear. You don't have to stay the whole time. I kind of do. Ashley squished a dandelion under the toe of her black flat. It would look weird if I left, since I planned it. Yeah, you planned it, so they already owe you. Ashley groaned. I can't just... She was interrupted by a car door slamming at the base of the hill. A white minivan was parked haphazard at the side of the valley highway with one tire on the road and the other sunken into the gravel shoulder. Ashley couldn't quite read the lime green writing on the side of the van, but she was almost positive it involved a cartoonish drawing of a ghost. A lanky man with brown skin and dark hair stepped out of the car, stretching his arms to the sky. He leaned into the passenger window, muttered a few words, and ambled to the gated dirt patch at the bottom of the road with a fistful of lilies. Ashley had lived in Snakebite her entire life, but she'd never seen someone visit Pioneer Cemetery on purpose. Where Snakebite Memorial was a rolling hilltop of gold grass and neat headstones, Pioneer Cemetery at the bottom of the hill was nothing but mounds of gray dirt over unnamed bodies. It was a historical landmark, a dedication to those who died on the Oregon Trail more than anything else. A stone slab stood at the front of the plot with an approximation of who was buried there. Gunderson baby, Madison girl, Anderson boy, but no one really knew who they were. Anyone who belonged to Snakebite was buried at the top of the hill beneath supple lawns facing the wide open valley. The man knew exactly where he was going, though. He strode past the stone key and approached a mound of dirt somewhat isolated from the rest. He paused there, eyes closed in a silent prayer before gently laying flowers over the dirt. The graves were only names without memory, but the man mourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. Loved hearing that in your voice. It was awesome. Our next reader is April Henry. Hi, April. April is the New York Times bestselling author of over 2,000 mysteries and thrillers for teens and adults. Roald Dahl helped her get her first story published when she was still in grade school. Thanks to her research, April knows how to kill you in 2 dozen different ways. That's pretty cool.
Hi, so I'm April. I do not know when I turned my thing to it's supposed to be my profile picture. It says Streamable Learning, which was a group that I talked to some students in South Carolina last month, and I guess now I'm forever branded as Streamable Learning. But I have 2 books up for the award, which is super exciting. I was just advising JC not to wear 2 pairs of Spanx the way I did a few years ago when I was up for an award because it was very uncomfortable. So the first book I'm going to be reading from is called Playing with Fire. It was inspired by the real 2019 fire where a kid was playing with fireworks in the Columbia Gorge and he set it on fire. You guys, anyone who was in Oregon at that time remembers that. And there was a group of people who were trapped at Punch Bowl Falls. There was about 140 people who had hiked there that day. It's very close to a parking lot. So it's only like a mile and a half. So people would walk there dressed very casually, maybe even just wearing a swimsuit with a towel around their waist and wearing flip-flops. And when he set this fire, it cut off the way back and there wasn't any cell service. Someone did manage to get cell service and they were advised that they needed to start heading the other way on highly technical trails. And they all made it out. But I thought, wow, when I saw that, I was like, it's like one of my books, only in this case, the serial killer is nature. So I changed the villain in the story. So it's a different person, and I'm going to read a single chapter. It's the very first chapter from his viewpoint. It's called A Blanket of Fire. So when Jason and Brian had scouted the stretch of road in the middle of the week, it had been empty. But now, early on a Saturday evening, Jason counted a half dozen parked cars. The lot for the nearby trail to Basin Falls must be full. Only Brian's plan had called for parking here, and he had made it clear that Jason shouldn't deviate from the plan. And so far, Brian's plan was going like clockwork. So Jason found a spot. Before he got out, he cranked down the windows. Then he opened up the back of the little 1984 Chevette he had bought off Craigslist. 400 cash, 300 for the car, and another 100 for not asking questions. Later, Jason had destroyed the burner phone he'd used to arrange the deal. The trunk of the hatchback was empty, except for a single road flare. After he retrieved it, Jason looked up and down the road, but didn't see anyone. He walked around the car until it was between him and the road. He pulled off the lid off the white cap to expose the coarse red striking surface. Then he twisted off the cap. He took a slow breath, trying to steady his nerves. Then, in a single fast movement, he struck the black button on the end of the flare across the coarse red surface on the plastic cap, like striking a giant match. It lit with a hiss and a shower of sparks, reminding him of fireworks. He tossed it to the back seat, the way Brian had said. And now he's supposed to walk away, walk back down the road to where it joined up with the bigger road. Brian would pick him up, and meanwhile, their getaway car would turn into a fireball, destroying any prints and DNA they had left. But what if the flare guttered and went out? A flame started on the stained fabric of the seat that began to inch up the back. It felt like magic. It just created it out of nothing. Now it danced and moved like a living thing. The flames were yellow at the center, then orange, and finally red at the edges. Smoke was beginning to billow out of the car. A breeze blew through the driver's side window and pulled the flames toward the middle of the car, pushed the flames toward the middle of the car. The smoke was turning from gray to black. It tasted acrid. Jason stepped back, coughing, still reluctant to walk away. What if someone showed up with a fire extinguisher and put it out? The flames reached out of the car, up past the roof. Inside, the headliner caught. It fell, a blanket of fire. Boom. The back glass of the hatchback shattered and a piece of metal shot toward him. It landed in the dry weeds, and suddenly they were on fire as well. Suddenly, everything was on fire. Jason turned and ran, trying to get ahead of the flames. So that's the first chapter, and I would like to thank YouTube for having lots of videos of people who light their cars on fire so I could see what it looked like. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, April. We'll hear from again shortly. All righty. Our next reader is Deborah Hopkinson. Hi, Deborah. Good to see you. Two-time Oregon Book Award winner, Deborah Hopkinson writes picture books, middle grade fiction, and nonfiction, focusing on history and environmental activism. Thanks for being here.
It's really wonderful to have this chance to talk about long form nonfiction and to have a nonfiction book included with these wonderful novels. The book last year, We Had to Be Brave, was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award. And We Must Not Forget, which I'll be reading from today a little bit, only came about because of that book. So We Had to Be Brave is the story of young people who escaped on the Nazis on the Kindertransport. And in writing that book, I got to know a woman named Ruth David, who I didn't meet in person, but had a wonderful email communication with her over several years. She had an incredible story. And I felt at the end of We Had to Be Brave that I hadn't yet picked up the rest of her story. So I'm going to read a little bit about her story in We Must Not Forget, but I'm going to preface it with one of the reasons why I write nonfiction about some of these topics. This is an excerpt from Jacob Presser, who was a Dutch Holocaust survivor and historian, and it's called To Give the Dead a Voice. When you have worked as I have for about 15 years with these documents, you are continuously confronted with the dead, the voices of the deceased. I read these papers, the little scraps of paper thrown from the train, the rare messages coming from Westerbork, an internment and transit camp in the Netherlands. Before me, hardly anyone has read them, and after me, they are locked into the archives, and it's possible that nobody else will see them. They awoke in me the awareness that one of the tasks of the historian, the man who writes about people of the past, is to give the dead a voice. The dead must be able to speak, and anyone who lets the dead remain silent allows them to die twice, and I have simply refused to permit that. And that's at the beginning of this book, which is a compilation of stories, true stories, from survivors and their families, it's arranged geographically. So in this case, Ruth and her sister, one of her sisters, both escaped on the Kindertransport. She was one of 6 children, and her 2 older half-brothers had escaped before World War II broke out. But her parents kept the 2 youngest with them, and they were in Mannheim, Germany, and were deported to France. So Ruth left at about the age of 10 and was living in a dorm that was set up in England for some of the, let's see if you can see her picture. I'm not really sure you can, but I'll put it as close as I can. Living, a Jewish community had set up in England. And so this is a little section called A Mother's Advice to Live By. Ruth wrote to her mother from England to say she could not imagine turning 13 on her next birthday in March of 1942. So she had been gone for about 3 years. In the midst of her own suffering and fear, Ruth's mother gave her daughters words she would treasure all her life. Her mother replied, "It is nearly 3 years since we have seen each other, and I'm sure you have changed considerably. Through these hard times, you have no doubt become a person of greater understanding, but I am sure you have remained my dear and good child. I'm happy to know that you have a good friend. That is something to value. I have true friends, and I'm very glad of them." And Ruth later wrote, "Still known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, May 8, 1945, should have been my mother's 53rd birthday. She was not to reach it. Her 50th was her last. We kept hoping for a long time. Accepting these deaths was difficult for all the hostel girls. Deep inside me, I knew it was true, but spent years hoping and making up impossible stories of how my parents were perhaps lost somewhere, were ill and could not explain who they were unable to speak, or who had forgotten where they once belonged. By some coincidence or miracle, we would find them one day. It was a vague and transient comfort, as daydreams are." Ruth later discovered that her parents, Moritz and Marguerite Oppenheimer, had been sent to Camp de Mille and then to Drancy on August 12, 1942. From there, they were part of Convoy 20, which departed for Auschwitz on August 17th, arriving on August 19th. Ruth learned that 900 people, including children, were gassed immediately. Her brother, now known as Michel, and sister Theo survived the war. Her parents had arranged for them to be taken away from the camp and hidden. They were taken in by the Sommer family in Paris. Michel became a glass blower. Theo married a young rabbinical student from Tunisia and became known for her North African cooking, as well as being a loving wife and mother. Ruth became a teacher and a mother of two. She published 2 books and traveled to Germany to talk about the Holocaust to young people. In 2012, she was awarded the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany for her dedication to peace and commitment to Holocaust education. The 6 Oppenheimer siblings never met all together again. In the 1950s, Ruth met Mina, her family's housekeeper, who was non-Jewish, once more. At some point after Ruth left for England in 1939, Mina defied Nazi laws to join the family in Mannheim. But in October of 1940, when the Oppenheimers and their 2 youngest children were deported to France, Mina could accompany them no farther. Before she left, Ruth's mother, Marguerite, handed Mina a binder filled with family letters, including letters Hannah and Ruth had sent from England, along with ones from Ruth's older brothers who were saved in Argentina and New York. Mother pushed an old file filled with letters into her arms and told her to keep them safe till she could hand them over to one of us. Here were our family letters, our only inheritance, handed to us by a very rare German Christian who had the courage to ignore the Nazi laws, regulations, propaganda, and the terror, said Ruth. In my understanding, she was both one of the righteous and a saint. As this book was going to print, I received a note from Ruth's daughter, Margaret Finch, to say that her mom had passed away from COVID-19 on April 6, 2020. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. It's so good to hear from you. All right, and our last reader for today is April.
Gotten cleanup. I've been really prolific the last couple of years, and hopefully that's going to stop soon because it's not easy to write a couple of books a year. But the second book is called Eyes of the Forest. It is very close to my heart because it's a book about what it is like to be a writer, and the main character, or 2 of the main characters, are a fantasy author who's very, very behind on finishing his fantasy, and a girl who's his biggest fan and his researcher, Bridget. So this chapter is, I think, the 3rd one in, and it's told from Bridget's point of view. Bridget, compelled to change by an outside force. Queen Jane regarded the assassin, a voice murmured in Bridget's left ear. You must find the babe, and you must kill it, or you and your family will die screaming. Belatedly, Bridget realized Mr. Manning was eyeing her. She straightened up and looked at him attentively. She resisted the urge to check if her hair completely covered the single earbud in the short stretch of wire that disappeared under the collar of her shirt. Normally, it wasn't hard to listen to an audiobook and a teacher simultaneously, but physics was sometimes challenging. While it's true that if a falling apple got Isaac Newton thinking about gravity, Mr. Manning said, there's no evidence one hit him on the head, but he did start wondering why apples always fall down rather than sideways or even up. He still seemed focused on Bridget, so she tried to look intent as he explained how Newton had postulated that everything in the universe was attracted to everything else in the universe. Calculating the degree of attraction required a complicated formula, but it basically depended on how far apart the 2 objects were, as well as their mass. Walker's stage whisper came from the last row, perfectly pitched to reach the other students, but not Mr. Manning. If that's true, then how come I'm not attracted to fat girls? As the offensive comment earned him a few snorts, Bridget exchanged an eye roll with AJ 1 seat over. Sensing trouble, Mr. Manning began to roam the aisles as he talked about mass and universal gravitation. Bridget's attention soon returned to the fine thread of words, connecting her to another far more interesting world. The audiobook's narrator had moved on to the hunt for the baby. In her mind's eye, Bridget was beside the assassin as he snuck down an alley. Together, they looked up, trying to spot foot and handholds in the rough wall. Once he climbed into the attic room, the assassin planned to kill Jancy, the newborn baby now lying in the arms of her mother, a serving girl named Marguerite. It was Marguerite's misfortune that one night, 9 months ago, she'd caught the king's eye, and that a seer had prophesied one of the king's children would grow up to overthrow him. The only solution seemed to be the murder of his own offspring, but the king had balked. When it came to his illegitimate children, Queen Jane was not nearly as squeamish. Newton began developing the law of physics when he was only 23, just 6 years older than you guys, Mr. Manning said. Derek, can you tell me the first law of motion? He liked to randomly call on students. Derek, a tall, skinny guy with a bad complexion, straightened up. Bridget had never talked to him, but she knew who he was. Everyone at school did, for all the wrong reasons. Basically, it says a body at rest will remain at rest, and a body in motion will remain in motion, unless they are compelled to change by an outside force. Walker made a sotto voce comment about bodies in motion, but Bridget paid no attention. The book was approaching one of her favorite scenes. The voice in her ear painted a picture of a cramped room, barely big enough to hold a straw-stuffed mattress. The low ceiling forced the assassin to stoop as he crept forward. The image was so vivid that Bridget reflexively hunched her shoulders. On the bed, a sleeping Marguerite lay curled around her baby. She was a long-legged, milk-white girl of some 6 and 10 years, a healthy wench to look at her. At least, the narrator warned, she would be until the assassin's dagger entered her heart. A dagger? Huh, was that dagger in the database? Bridget jotted in the notebook hidden under her classroom notes. R.M. Hadden's fantasies were famous for the wide variety of weapons the characters wielded, from dirks to double-bladed axes to the misericordiae, a long, narrow knife used to deliver a merciful death to gravely wounded knights. Even though she was focused on the details, the overall story still enthralled Bridget. It didn't matter that she'd heard or read it more than a dozen times before, that she knew how the assassin's mission would fail, or how the blind seer's prophecy would come true in surprising ways. Bridget was so enraptured that she didn't notice Mr. Manning had stopped speaking, didn't glimpse him creeping up behind her, didn't hear AJ's frantic throat clearing. And then the teacher's fingers plucked away her earbud. She let out a shocked bleat as he held it out of reach, the wire stitched tight. Hand me your phone, Mr. Manning ordered. She slipped her phone from her pocket. In order to give it to him, she had to pop the earbud wire from the jack. When she did, the narrator's plummy tones suddenly filled the classroom. His dagger was poised to plunge into the sleeping girl when, to his surprise, he saw a knife glinting in her left hand. The blade was as thin as she was. Then the point was under his chin, pressing his head up. Drop it, Marguerite said calmly. When he did not comply, she twisted her own blade. The babe whimpered as a trickle of blood, looking more black than red, dripped onto its skin. She whispered, sleep, Chancy. The assassin, Mr. Manning, stabbed a button on her phone and it mercifully fell silent. Was that King of Swords? He asked, incredulous. It was clear he'd expected to hear a popular song, not a book published before Bridget was born. Its age didn't stop anyone from enjoying it now. Hadden lived in a Portland suburb, but people all over the world had read King of Swords, its sequels, or the graphic novel adaptation, or at least seen the spin-off TV show. Bridget nodded. Her cheeks were on fire. She cursed her redhead's complexion for betraying her. She'd been caught on her phone before, but at least then no one had known exactly what she was listening to. Were people now going to lump her in with Derek, known school-wide as the weird loner who spent his weekends live-action role-playing, LARPing at a game inspired by Swords and Shadows? Because while it was mostly fine to be a fan, there was an unspoken line, and once you were perceived to have crossed it, you became socially inept, a geeky pariah. Behind her, Walker was saying something about Queen of Kooks, but Bridget ignored him. She sat in miserable silence until class ended and Mr. Manning handed her phone back. As she gathered her things, AJ leaned over her. All that trouble just for a book? He raised one eyebrow, but his dark eyes were friendly. Whenever Mr. Manning or Walker were being unbelievably annoying, they would trade glances and the occasional whisper. It's not just a book. She lowered her voice as Derek walked by. She was relieved that he wasn't seeking her out. It's King of Swords by R.M. Hadden. Those books always look so thick. With his fingers, AJ measured a space about 4 inches high. And I'm not a big reader. You haven't seen the TV show? He shrugged. You have no idea what you're missing. Want to fill me in over lunch? For a moment, Bridget forgot about the assassin, Marguerite and Jancy. She forgot to think at all. There was only AJ standing close enough. She was aware of the warmth emanating from his skin and the faint smell of ginger on his clothes. AJ was with thick black brows and friendly dark eyes. AJ, who had been whispering little asides to her all fall. AJ, who was now shifting from foot to foot, waiting for her answer. If she were a character, what would she do? Simper, flirt, turn down AJ and leave him disconsolate? More than anyone else in the world, Bridget could imagine how she might handle this situation if she were fictional. But she wasn't. And she wasn't a queen or a peasant girl or a courtesan. She was just Bridget. And all she could think of to say was a faint, sure. And that ring light I have makes it extremely hard to go look down at my book and read, but thank you.
Thank you. It was awesome. I loved hearing it. I want to invite all our finalists back on. Yay. I don't know if Deborah's here. Deborah. Well, I just want to thank you all. Oh, there she is. I want to thank all our finalists for making time this morning on a Saturday to be here. It was so great to hear you all. And I want to also thank our audience for being here. And want to remind you all that our Oregon Book Awards ceremony will return to in-person this year at the Armory, and that is on April 25th. I would love to see you all there, and I'm so excited to be able to celebrate you all in person. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
It's great to hear you all read.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful Saturday, and I will see you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank
Keep
you.
reading.